Sometimes the scariest unsolved cases happen in your own mind, like being tormented by disturbing thoughts that you don't want, can't control, and can't stop replaying. People with OCD often feel driven to do certain mental or physical behaviors like replaying past events or following very specific routines or avoiding certain people or certain situations to try and cope with the anxiety caused by their thoughts. And the thing is, these behaviors only provide short-term relief, and trying to fight OCD thoughts can just make them come back stronger. But the amazing thing is, OCD is highly treatable with the right kind of specialized therapy. What works for OCD is ERP therapy, or exposure and response prevention. NoCD is the world's leading provider of OCD treatment. All of their licensed therapists truly understand OCD and specialize in treating it with ERP. To learn more about starting OCD therapy with NoCD, go to nocd.com to book a free call to learn more about how they can help. That's nocd.com. Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another episode of Killer Instinct, you guys. Thank you so much for joining me here today. If you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah and I'm your host of Killer Instinct. And before we get started, make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way you never miss an episode. We post weekly here on the podcast every single Wednesday. You are not going to want to miss it. We also upload the video version onto YouTube on Wednesdays as well, so make sure you're subscribed. And if you're looking for more exclusive Killer Instinct content, you can always find that over on our Patreon. We post an additional 3 episodes a month over on Patreon, and we end the month with an exclusive live stream as well. So all of those links can always be found in the description box below. And with that being said, you guys, hello. I feel like I cannot jump into this episode without just doing a little bit of a check-in. If you are unaware, I have been taking a little bit of a hiatus. I know it doesn't really seem like that because we have been uploading Patreon episodes onto YouTube for the past several weeks now. However, I have been gone for about a month. And this feels so good. I have missed you guys so much. I have missed doing this so much, and it has only been a month, but it feels like forever. And I'm so happy to be back. If you were unaware, I got married in the beginning of October. I took about a 2-week honeymoon after that, and now I'm back and we are in the swing of things again. I am so happy to be here with you today, and I'm very eager to jump into this case with you. As you guys can tell by the title of today's episode, today we are talking about the solved, twisted case of Leslie Prior. This truly is one that is going to leave you absolutely shocked, and I'm very curious to hear all your opinions about it. So with that being said, let's jump right on into it today. Leslie Prior was born on October 5th, 1952 in Rhode Island to her parents, William and Miriam. She was one of 8 children and grew up in a military family. In 1963, her family moved to Pensacola, Florida, where Leslie attended Pensacola High School. And after her graduation, she moved on to attend the University of Florida, where she studied journalism. And it was while at the University of Florida that Leslie met a man who would later go on to be her husband. And that was a man named Carl Prior. Now, Carl also went by the name Sandy, which is what we are going to be referring to him as. And when Sandy and Leslie met, they fell in love quickly and they got married in 1974. And 3 years later, they had their first child together. They had their first and only child, Lauren. Now, Leslie was known to be warm, welcoming, inviting, and compassionate. Everyone who knew Leslie said that she was absolutely beautiful from the inside out. Now, in 1982, the Priors decided that they were going to pack up their things and relocate. They decided to move from Florida, where they were previously residing, to Chevy Chase, Maryland. Now, Chevy Chase is considered to be a very nice and private neighborhood. It's very picturesque, it's very idyllic, it's very well kept, and it was considered a great place to raise a family. Now, Lauren describes her childhood as one that was very idyllic. She said that her and her parents were incredibly close. It was just the three of them. So they were very, very tight knit. She said that they had family dinners every single night where they chatted about their days and what was coming up in their schedules. She said that Sandy cooked breakfast every single Saturday while Lauren remembered her mom consistently gardening in the front yard. She just said that her childhood was filled with very happy moments and happy memories. Now, people describe Sandy as very thoughtful. He was known to be the life of the party. He was considered a family man, and those who knew Leslie and Sandy claimed that their relationship seemed to be very picturesque from the outside. It seemed like they got along very well. They had a very healthy looking relationship from the outside looking in. Now, this case begins on Wednesday, May 2nd of the year 2001. Now, on the specific day, like I said, it was a Wednesday, Leslie was scheduled to go into work at 10 a.m. However, she never arrived. Now, initially, Leslie's coworkers thought that maybe she was just running late. Maybe she had an appointment or the bus that she routinely took was running behind. But as time kept passing and Leslie still did not arrive to the office, her coworkers grew more and more concerned. So much so that Leslie's boss, Brett Reedy, called Sandy and told him that she had never showed up at the time that she usually did. Now, when Sandy heard this, he expressed immediate concern and also confusion. He didn't understand why Leslie wouldn't have gone to work that day. According to Sandy, he told Brett that the last time he saw Leslie was at 7:45 earlier that same morning when he himself was going off to work, and he claimed that everything was fine and that there was no reason for Leslie not to be at the office. Now, both Brett and Sandy through this phone call agreed that they would go and check up on Leslie together at Leslie and Sandy's home, since it was only about a mile and a half away from where Leslie worked. Brett said that he would go and check on her, and then Sandy also said, well, I'll meet you over there. That was kind of the cadence of the conversation. Now, Brett arrived to the home first, and he did wait outside for Sandy, who arrived shortly afterwards, and both men walked through the front door of the home together, and immediately, according to Brett, he claimed that something was very, very wrong. Brett could tell almost instantaneously that something had happened. He claimed that when walking through the front door and through the first floor of the home, there was blood all through the foyer of the home. It was on the floor, it was on the door hinges, it was smeared on the wall. There was a side table that had been knocked over, and it appeared that there had been some sort of a struggle that took place. Now, Sandy and Brett, they started walking through the home, calling out for Leslie. However, they were not getting any response. And this is when they decided to split up in looking for Leslie. Brett was walking the downstairs area of the home while Sandy split off from him and went up to the second story of the home, the upstairs of the home, while Brett stayed downstairs. Now, after searching the upstairs area, Sandy then came downstairs and claimed that Leslie was not upstairs. He said that she wasn't up there, and so he continued by walking into the basement of the home, and then he met Brett back in the kitchen. But after neither one of these men were able to locate Leslie, this is when Brett decided to contact 911. Now, after hearing Brett explain the circumstances, the 911 operator told the men to leave the home. They told Brett that him and Sandy needed to walk outside and wait for police to arrive. And after about approximately 5 minutes, at 11:45 a.m., the police arrived to the Preer home. Now, according to Brett, he claimed that when the police got there, Sandy approached the officers and greeted the police. However, when he did that, the cops immediately pulled out their guns and turned their guns onto Sandy in that moment. And according to Brett, Sandy's response to this was a little bit off-putting for him. He claimed that Sandy's response to this was saying, "Oh, you guys mean business," almost in a joking manner, and Brett just did not understand why Sandy would have that type of attitude in this current moment. However, he did claim that while he thought the response from Sandy was odd, he also just thought that it was very possible that Sandy was in a state of denial in that moment. Now, when the police entered the home, Sandy and Brett stayed outside of the house. They remained outside, and this is when Sandy and Brett started conversing with one another, and according to Brett, he claimed that Sandy told him that he believed that the reason for the blood in the house must have been because Leslie had fallen. He said that he thought that Leslie must have fallen and that was why there was blood in the foyer. That was his reasoning. But according to Brett, he said that the amount of blood that he saw and the placement of that blood made him believe like there was something far more sinister at play here. And again, for Brett, this only fed his theory that there was some sort of delusion happening with Sandy. Sandy was a little bit in denial and he wasn't coming to terms with what was really happening here. Brett felt like Sandy had been very quick to search the upstairs of the home when they first arrived. And after making the comment that Sandy did about him believing that Leslie had fallen, Brett then asked Sandy if he searched the upstairs of the home thoroughly, if he thoroughly checked, if he thoroughly went through every room, because everyone thought it was a little odd and obviously very concerning that Leslie had not been found in the house. Obviously, there was blood in the home, but Leslie had not been found in the home. And Brett felt like Sandy had been very quick to search the upstairs area of the home when they had first arrived. And Brett said that when he was having this conversation with Sandy, he almost saw a light bulb go off in Sandy's mind. And Sandy told Brett in that instant that he did not check the master bathroom. So Leslie and Sandy's bedroom, Sandy did not check the bathroom of that bedroom. And according to Brett, there was almost this epiphany, this aha moment coming from Sandy of, oh my gosh, I did not check the master bathroom. So at this point, Brett and Sandy made the officers aware that Sandy had not checked that bathroom in the home. And so police went back into the house. They went upstairs into their bedroom and police walked back outside shortly afterwards to speak with Sandy and Brett. Police walked up to Sandy and told him that they had discovered Leslie's body in the master bathroom of the home. They claimed that she was laying on the ground of the shower with the water still running. So the shower was on, Leslie was laying on the floor of the shower. Now, an autopsy was conducted and it showed that Leslie had several lacerations to her head and that she was also strangled. And based off of the crime scene and the blood that was found, police believed that the injuries to her head came from Leslie's head being slammed into the floor in the foyer, and her cause of death was ruled to be blunt force trauma to the head. Now, one of the first things that police did in this investigation to try and figure out what exactly happened here was they went door to door to speak to neighbors of the Preers. Now, with it being such a close, tight-knit community, the neighbors were very observant of one another. And while all the neighbors claimed that the Preers seemed to be a generally very happy family, they didn't see anything that was of major cause of concern, one neighbor did claim that in the late night hours to the early morning hours of May 2nd, this specific neighbor had woken up in the middle of the night and looked out their window and saw that all of the lights in the Preer home were on, but the blinds were shut. Now remember, this was the same day that Leslie's body was discovered. This neighbor claimed that they remembered at the time thinking that this was very odd. However, they just went back to bed. There was then another neighbor who claimed that on the morning of May 2nd, they saw Sandy walk out of the front door of their home to leave for work, and Sandy called out and waved to this neighbor saying good morning to her. This was a very good morning neighborhood. You see your neighbors, you say good morning, you say good night, you say good evening, you greet your neighbors. And once this neighbor heard that Leslie had been found dead in her home, they wondered and started to speculate if Sandy could have said good morning to almost solidify to this neighbor that he was leaving the house, almost to solidify a potential alibi if that was necessary. Now, before we move any further, I do want to point out as well that Lauren was no longer living in the home at the time of her mother's murder. She had graduated high school and gone off to college at this point, so she was off. She was an adult. She was living her life, and she was not home at the time of the murder. She was not living there. She was not there. So I just wanted to point that out as well. So 2 days after Leslie's murder, on May 4th, police sat down with Sandy for their first formal interview with him. And police's main goal in this interview was to figure out the timeline of everything. They wanted to figure out what Sandy was doing the day before Leslie's murder. They wanted to figure out what he did the day of Leslie's murder, because they were still having a hard time trying to pinpoint a time of death for Leslie, which was going to be crucial in this case. They didn't know if it was the morning of May 2nd. They weren't able to tell if it was the late night hours of May 1st. They were really trying to narrow down a timeline here. And with Leslie's body being found in the shower with the hot water running on her, it definitely can affect the stages of decomposition and wipe off any potential DNA that would have been found on her body. So police were really trying to focus on narrowing down a time frame. And when speaking to Sandy, he claimed that on Tuesday, so May 1st, the day before the murder, it was a regular day. He claimed that he went to work, and afterwards he went to 3 different technology stores to look for a specific computer battery that he needed. So he didn't get home until approximately 9 p.m. on Tuesday night. And he claimed that there was nothing out of the ordinary about the specific night. He said that when he got home, he went right to bed actually. He just got home, went to sleep, and that Leslie had stayed up, and that he wasn't sure how much longer Leslie stayed awake than he did, but he remembered Leslie coming to bed at some point in the middle of the night while he was sleeping. So that was his story about Tuesday. He woke up, went to work, left work, went to these tech stores, got home at 9 p.m. and immediately went to bed, while Leslie stayed up a little bit later than he did, however, ultimately got into bed sometime later in that night. Now, Sandy also opened up in this conversation about the state of his and Leslie's marriage. This was something that police were very interested in and something that they were very focused on in the investigation. They wanted to figure out what state Leslie and Sandy's marriage was in at the time of her murder. Now, Sandy was very transparent with authorities in saying that at the time of her death, Leslie and Sandy had a lot of tension in their marriage, and there was tension surrounding multiple areas. There was tension surrounding finances. They were both trying to stay on top of bills. And according to Sandy, he claimed that Leslie did turn to drinking at this time in their marriage to try and suppress some of that tension. However, according to Sandy, he claimed that the drinking brought out a very ugly side of Leslie. He said that when Leslie would drink, her personality would shift, and it was because of her drinking and how consistently she was doing it that Sandy would come home later and later in the evening, so he wouldn't have to face Leslie, so he wouldn't have to deal with Leslie while she was in that state. Now, Sandy did agree to take a lie detector test regarding his knowledge to Leslie's murder, and when the results came back, it showed that Sandy had failed the polygraph test. Now, as you can imagine, all roads for police, all roads that police were looking at this point in the investigation, they were all leading back to Sandy, and this polygraph test only further confirmed that for them. So the days and weeks were passing after Leslie's murder, and Sandy was continuously having multiple conversations with the authorities. There was not an arrest made. However, more conversations were happening, more questions were being asked, and about 3 weeks after Leslie's murder, Sandy sat down with investigators again, but this time he changed his tune. He told authorities that he would no longer be answering any of their questions, which from the authorities' standpoint only increased their suspicion of Sandy. However, from Sandy's standpoint, he felt like he had given police everything that they wanted, everything that they asked for, and he felt like the walls were really closing in on him, and he felt that the police had tunnel vision to really just pin this murder on him when he was adamantly denying everything. But 2 months after Leslie's murder, there was a new piece of forensic evidence that would have police questioning that suspicion. It would have police questioning if Sandy truly was responsible for this. Forensic evidence showed that there was an unknown male's DNA found underneath Leslie's fingernails. Now, this unknown male, it was not Sandy. The DNA did not belong to Sandy, and police believed that it belonged to Leslie's attacker. They believed that Leslie was fighting for her life and that the DNA had gotten under her fingernails. And this DNA profile was also found in the blood that was found in the home. It was found in the blood from under the baseboard. There was also blood in the kitchen doorway. There was blood on the interior side of the kitchen door, and it was all a match to this unknown male's DNA. Now, again, I want to emphasize the DNA was not a match to Sandy Prieur, and the DNA was also not a match to anyone that was already in the system. And this only raised more questions for authorities, who again at this point were thinking it was very possible that Sandy was responsible. But now things were starting to look a little bit different. Police then took the DNA and focused on Leslie's workplace, and they obtained DNA samples from all of her male coworkers. However, none of those came back as a match either. So now police were somewhat at a standstill in the investigation, and unfortunately, it remained that way for quite some time. Sometimes the scariest unsolved cases happen in your own mind, like being tormented by disturbing thoughts that you don't want, can't control, and can't stop replaying. I'm talking about those thoughts like, I noticed someone else, so I'm terrified I'm going to cheat on my partner and ruin everything. Or that memory that I have felt fuzzy. Did I make it up? And what if something terrible happened and I just forgot? So if this sounds familiar to you, you might be experiencing OCD, and you're far from alone. I have OCD too, and it's more common than you might think, but it's also one of the most misunderstood mental health conditions out there. Because the truth is, real OCD is nothing like the stereotypes about liking things organized. It's a serious and highly misunderstood condition where unwanted, distressing thoughts get stuck on repeat in your mind, and you feel compelled to engage in certain behaviors to try and make them stop. These unwanted thoughts are what's called intrusive thoughts. People with OCD often feel driven to do certain mental or physical behaviors like replaying past events or following very specific routines or avoiding certain people or certain situations to try and cope with the anxiety caused by their thoughts. But the amazing thing is OCD is highly treatable with the right kind of specialized therapy. What works for OCD is ERP therapy, or exposure and response prevention, not standard talk therapy, which can actually just make things worse. NoCD is the world's leading provider of OCD treatment. All of their licensed therapists truly understand OCD and specialize in treating it with ERP. NoCD therapists are trained by world-renowned experts in OCD, and they know how to help take the power away from the intrusive thoughts and allow you to live the life that you want to live. Therapy with NoCD is 100% virtual, covered by insurance for over 155 million Americans, and includes support between sessions, so you're never facing OCD alone. To learn more about starting OCD therapy with NoCD, go to nocd.com to book a free call to learn more about how they can help. That's nocd.com. So then that leads us to about exactly a year after Leslie's murder, and Leslie's daughter Lauren sat down with detectives to get an update on her mom's case. And in this conversation, police told Lauren that despite this unknown male's DNA underneath her mom's fingernails, they still believed that Sandy was involved in Leslie's murder. They believed that all roads led back to Sandy despite the DNA that was found. And Lauren, from the very beginning, had been very adamant that she did not believe that Sandy, her father, was involved in Leslie's murder. And when police brought this to her attention yet again, she was very defensive of her father. She was very protective of Sandy, and she stated that there was no way that her dad was responsible for this. She stated that Sandy was not possessive, he was not aggressive, and there was no way that he would have ended Leslie's life. She just said it did not happen that way. point blank, period. And police really had no DNA evidence to prove that to be the case either. They had no DNA evidence or no real evidence that wasn't circumstantial that pointed to Sandy being responsible. Everything was just theories and thoughts and, again, circumstantial evidence. Now, because there were no new answers and no new leads and no new information coming forward, Leslie's case unfortunately went cold. But that was until about 2010, when a group of cold case detectives took over Leslie Pryor's case. Now, something that these new investigators did is they took another look at everyone in the neighborhood, everyone in the Pryor's neighborhood, and they took DNA from all the males that were living there at that time. However, there was not a match there either. And because these new investigators felt like they were at a standstill as well, the case went cold again for years. Now, Sandy actually ended up passing away in 2017 at the age of 67. And when he passed away, the case was still cold at that time. And in 2022 is when things really took a shift. In this case, there was a detective named Tara Augustine who was joined by Allison DuPois, and the two were in a cold case unit, and they took a look at the Leslie Pryor case and investigation. Now, with the new developments in technology, these two women were hoping that maybe they could finally bring Leslie and her family justice. And the biggest thing that Tara and Allison looked at was that unknown male DNA. This was the missing puzzle piece in this case, and the two detectives decided to run that DNA through forensic genetic genealogy. And this was a big deal because this was the newest major advancement since this case had last been looked at. This was the newest advancement in technology since the case had last been looked at. That unknown male DNA had been sent through the system to see if there was any match to anyone who was already previously in the system, but there was no genetic genealogy at that time that any of the investigators were able to do to try and match this specific unknown male DNA. And so, as we've seen before, investigators have really been using genetic genealogy to try and solve a lot of these cold cases. And for many of them, it has been the missing key and the missing link that they have needed in order to bring these cases and these victims justice. So that unknown male's DNA that was found underneath Leslie Pryor's fingernails, it was sent out to a private lab to examine. They ran it through the genealogy system, and there were a lot of results that they got back in return. Some were in the country, some were international, out of the United States, and the ones that were actually out of the country were coming back as a stronger match than some of the domestic matches. Now, specifically, there was a very strong hit that came back from someone who lived in Romania. Now, this suggested to the detectives that whoever the suspect is, it could be someone with very strong Romanian ancestry. Now, they then decided to take a deeper look into this, and they learned that one of the Romanian ancestry matches was a first cousin twice removed from the suspect. So I know that this can get a little confusing, but basically, to break it down, after they did the genealogy, they found that one of the matches was a first cousin twice removed from their suspect. Now, after going through countless records, countless dental records, marriage records, all of the things, they came across a name, the detectives did, that stood out to them. And that name, it was a last name. And that last name was Gligor. Now, it stood out to them in particular when they saw that name, and they remembered seeing it in previous investigative files pertaining to Leslie's case. And the reason that it was familiar to them was because the name Gligor was the same last name as Lauren's ex-boyfriend, Eugene Gligor. Now, Eugene was Lauren's high school boyfriend. The two met in high school, and there was a 2-year age difference, with Lauren being older. Lauren said that she was drawn to Eugene for his charismatic behavior. He was a ladies' man. He was popular. He was someone that everyone wanted, and he was known to be very outgoing and very witty. He was very personable and a great conversationalist. Eugene came from a 4-person household. It was him, his parents, and his younger brother. brother, and Eugene was living with his family in a neighborhood called Kenwood. Now, Kenwood was a 10-minute walk from where the Preers lived. In fact, there was actually a walking trail that connected the two neighborhoods. So for Lauren and Eugene, when they were dating, it was great because they could just easily walk back and forth on this walking trail that was specifically designed to connect one neighborhood to the other. Now, Lauren claimed that Leslie loved Eugene and vice versa. Eugene loved Leslie as well. Sometimes Eugene would be at Lauren's house without her even being there, just hanging out with her parents and waiting for her to come home. Lauren said that the relationship with Eugene was very serious. She was picturing a future with Eugene. They dated all throughout high school and even continued dating when Lauren got into college, but it was after 5 years that they decided to end the relationship in 1999. Lauren said that at this point, the relationship had just simply run its course and they ended on very amicable terms. Lauren said that after the relationship had ended, her and Eugene really didn't keep in touch after that. They didn't keep in contact. And after high school, after Eugene specifically had graduated high school, he had moved to New York where he worked as a server at a Michelin star restaurant. Afterwards, he moved back to DC. He ended up getting married twice and divorced both times as well. And it seemed like his life was seemingly very normal for all things considered. There was nothing really that stood out about it. But this new genealogy match, coming back and tracing all the way back to Gligor, that name, the detectives knew that this was not just some coincidence. And the genealogy match was enough for police to follow through with an arrest because now they had physical evidence. They had physical DNA. Just seeing the genealogy report, they were able to do this. However, when the detectives, Allison and Tara, went through Eugene's file again, they noticed something else that stood out to them. And that was the fact that Eugene had actually missed Leslie's funeral. Now, there was a reason that this was important because you might be sitting here thinking, well, Lauren and Eugene really aren't close anymore. They aren't friends anymore. So it makes sense that he wouldn't have gone or he wouldn't have been there. Eugene was in town at the time that Leslie was murdered. He was in Chevy Chase, Maryland at the time of Leslie's murder. However, he decided not to go to the funeral, which many people did think was unusual because even though Eugene and Lauren were no longer together, they still had a lot of mutual friends. Many of Lauren's friends from high school attended the funeral. Leslie had a huge funeral. There were many, many people there. And at one point, Lauren did consider Eugene a part of the family. So she did find it odd when he was not at the funeral, but police found it odd, especially because Eugene's brother and parents had both attended the funeral. But instead of going to the funeral, Eugene booked a last-minute, unplanned cross-country road trip to Portland, Oregon. Now, from Lauren's perspective, something she said that always stood out about Eugene was the fact that her father, Sandy, never liked Eugene. Sandy would always mention that he just felt like something was very off about Eugene. And even after Leslie's murder, Sandy asked Lauren if she believed that Eugene could be responsible for this, which Lauren shrugged off at the time because the big question in her mind, along with everyone else's question in their minds, was why would Eugene want to do something like this? What motive would he have to do something like this? Eugene didn't have a violent criminal history. There was nothing that was pointing to a motive in this crime. However, when detectives took a closer look at Eugene's history, they learned that not everything was as it seemed on the surface with Eugene. When doing this, they learned that Eugene had been struggling with an alcohol addiction, and it was something he was very open about. He was very open about his journey with sobriety. But detectives also learned that his second ex-wife, had actually filed for a protective order and reported an incident to authorities where, after they separated, Eugene came to get his belongings from their home that he was no longer living in without informing his second ex-wife that he was coming to get these things. So she actually wrote in her statement, quote, "Eugene is an addict and has 2 guns. His behavior has been erratic and scary for about 2 years, often and on. I'm scared to be in my home. He's unpredictable. Eugene repeatedly calls me a whore to my face. He throws objects, punches walls, and I fear for my safety when he has these outbursts. I'm seeking protection from this verbal abuse and escalation. Now, the protective order, believe it or not, it was actually denied by the courts, who stated that there was not enough evidence to prove that any of this was true. So the protective order was denied, but when detectives sat down with this specific ex-wife who recalled the incident with Eugene coming into the home without her knowledge, she explained that when she was with Eugene, she genuinely feared for her life. She saw a violent streak in Eugene, a scary side of Eugene where she felt like he was very much capable of causing immense harm. Now, ultimately to the detectives, this was obviously a red flag because it showed a side to Eugene that had not been shown before. It showed a side of Eugene that not many people knew. Everyone only had the best of things to say about this man up until this very moment, but now police are seeing a side to Eugene that not many people were aware of, and it was a dangerous one. But even with this, police still needed more proof that connected Eugene to the murder specifically, and they needed Eugene's DNA to compare it to what was found at the scene. Because even though they had the DNA that connected to the last name Gligor, they needed to connect it to Eugene specifically. Now, detectives learned that at the time that they were gathering all of this information, Eugene was actually out of the country. However, he was scheduled to come back, and detectives actually had his flight information. So what they did is they essentially set up a sting operation with the help of the TSA agents at the airport. The plan was for Eugene to go through customs and get pulled aside by a TSA agent into a separate room for what they would tell him would be a special screening. They were going to offer him a water bottle, hoping he would take it and leave behind his DNA. And luckily for the detectives, that is exactly what happened. Police obtained Eugene's DNA, and when they compared it to the DNA found under Leslie's fingernails and the DNA found at the scene, it came back to be an exact match. Eugene's DNA was a match to the DNA found at the crime scene. He was Leslie's killer. And on June 18th of 2024, so just last year, about a year and a half ago, 44-year-old Eugene was living in Washington, D.C. when he was arrested at his home. Now, immediately upon his arrest, Eugene was acting confused, asking what was this about. He was brought down to the police station for questioning, and detectives Tara and Allison sat down with Eugene to get his account of what happened and hopefully some more answers. Now, Eugene stated that he remembered Leslie being murdered. He remembered that happening. However, he claimed that he was not the one responsible for it. So he remembered hearing about it, but said that he was not connected to it whatsoever. Now, detectives did state that Eugene was initially cooperative in answering questions. However, when the questions started to get a little bit more difficult and he was confronted with evidence, his behavior shifted. When Eugene learned that his DNA was a match to the crime scene, his response was, quote, "I don't know what to say. I have no recollection and no memory. I don't know what to say." End quote. Now, detectives tried to obtain any information from Eugene. However, he was not willing to cooperate. He began getting emotional. However, there were no tears. And the detectives actually pointed this out to him during his interrogation by saying that they felt like this was very performative. And his response was that he was dry. That's why he said he wasn't crying and that there were no tears, because he was dry. Safe to say, Eugene was definitely putting on quite a show for the detectives, and ultimately, Eugene asked for an attorney. Now, many people were shocked to hear of Eugene's arrest, Lauren specifically, as you can imagine. When she heard that Eugene was arrested and charged and she heard the evidence, she was absolutely floored. Lauren claimed that she never felt unsafe around Eugene when they were together and when they were dating. She said that there was not a moment that passed where she felt like she was in any danger whatsoever. She said that when she heard it was Eugene, she actually wanted to faint. That was how much in disbelief she was. Now, initially, when Eugene was charged with Leslie's murder, he pled not guilty and the the case was going to trial. However, in May of just this year, 2025, Eugene shocked everyone when he pled guilty to second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Now, even with this plea, it still raises the question, why did Eugene kill Leslie? And the detectives do have their own theories as to what the motive was. And according to them, they believe that on May 2nd, 2001, Eugene was attempting to rob or break into the Prier home, not expecting Leslie to be there. They believe that when Eugene walked in, he panicked because he knew Leslie was going to recognize him. Obviously, he had dated her daughter for years and years, so he decided to kill her instead. Now, there are many people that question that theory and that motive. Some question the level of violence that came into this murder and just the randomness of the kill. Eugene was not known for breaking and entering. He was not known to be really doing that. So it just didn't make a lot of sense as to why he would start there and why he would start then. So it raises a lot of questions. To this day, a lot of people still have the question, why did Eugene do this? And unfortunately, we still don't really have the answer. Now, during his sentencing, Eugene did speak. He stated, quote, "I am sorry it has taken me this long to take full responsibility. I'm grateful the time has come, and I'm relieved that the secret is over. I had many blackouts leading up to the night of May 1st and on the morning of May 2nd, 2001, but none that resulted in the most regretful and devastating event of my life," end quote. Now, along with that, there was a memorandum submitted by the prosecution that gave a little bit more insight to Eugene's version of events. Eugene told his attorneys that on the morning of May 2nd, he woke up and drank a combination of mixed drinks and shots before driving to work. So he drank all of these things and then drove to work, but stopped off at the Prier household at approximately 9:30 a.m. He stated that he had a vague memory of him walking into the home and getting into a physical altercation with Leslie. However, he did not remember the murder itself or leaving her in the shower, which to me, I have a hard time believing, just because if you have the memory of going into the house, it is difficult to believe that you wouldn't have a memory of the murder itself. But again, that is what he claims happened. Now, after the plea was taken, Eugene had been sentenced to 22 years in prison with an additional 5 years of probation. I am so curious to hear your guys' opinions about this and to get your take and what you believe truly happened here. Do you believe that Eugene is telling the truth regarding his version of events? Do you believe he knows more? Do you believe that there was a different motive involved that we haven't talked about? Let me know in the comments below. But with that being said, you guys, it's going to be all for me today. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Killer Instinct. Again, if you're new here, hi, my name is Savannah. I'm your host. Make sure you go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We post weekly here every single Wednesday. You're not going to want to miss it. I'll be back next week with a brand new one for you guys. And until then, stay safe. Bye, guys.